Rose Chen pressed her fingernails into her own palm, hard enough to bleed, hard enough to feel real, because if she felt pain, she was still alive. And if she was still alive, they hadn't won yet. Her father was selling her, in broad daylight, in the middle of a Texas summer, for less than the price of a decent meal, and not one single person in that crowd said a word to stop it. If this story moves you, subscribe, stay until the end, and drop your city in the comments. Let me see how far this story travels. The morning Rose Chen was sold. The sky over Dust Haven, Texas, was the color of hammered copper. Not sunrise gold, not the soft blue of a forgiving dawn. Copper, hard and merciless and hot, before the sun had even fully cleared the ridge. The kind of sky that told you right from the start today is not going to be kind to you. Rose had been awake since before it. She hadn't slept, not really. She'd lain on the thin straw mattress in the back room of her father's house, the room without a window, the room that locked from the outside and stared at the ceiling and listened to the voices on the other side of the wall. Her father, Chen Bingwen. Her brother, Wei. She didn't have to press her ear to the wood to hear them. They weren't being quiet about it. The man from Galveston said 20, Wei was saying. But I think we can do better if we bring her to the auction pen first. Let a few men bid. She's too old, her father said. 26. No one's going to bid high for 26. She looks younger. She looks tired. A pause. Then her father again, his voice flatter, now resolved. Dress her in the wedding dress, the white one. Makes her look valuable, presentable. Rose closed her eyes. She thought about her mother Mei Ling, who had died when Rose was 12 and left her with nothing but a small red cloth pouch and the memory of a woman who smelled like jasmine and had hands that never stopped moving. Her mother had been the only person in the Chen household who had ever looked at Rose and seen something worth keeping. With Mei Ling gone, Rose had become furniture, useful furniture for a while, cooking, cleaning, mending, fetching. And then, as the years passed, and no man came to marry her, and no gold came from her labor, she had become something worse than furniture. She had become a problem. They're going to sell me, she thought, lying in the dark, the heat already pressing down on the room like a physical weight. They are going to sell me today. She pressed her fingernails into her palm. Hard. Harder. The pain was sharp and real and hers. She was still here. She was still breathing. Whatever happened in the next few hours, they couldn't take that. Not yet. The wedding dress had been her mother's. That was the part that nearly broke her. Not the selling, not the crowd that would gather, not the humiliation of being stood up in the town square like a piece of livestock at a county fair. Those things were terrible, yes. But the dress. Her mother had made it herself over the course of 3 months the year before she died, stitching tiny red peonies along the hem in the old style. The way women did it back in Fujian province, before the crossing, before California, before Texas, before everything that had come after. The dress was white cotton, practical and strong, but those red flowers transformed it into something sacred. Something that said, a woman wore this. A woman who mattered. Rose had kept it in a cedar box under the floorboard for 14 years. She had taken it out sometimes in the private dark and held it against her chest. And now Wei was handing it to her through the unlocked door with the same expression he used when he handed her a bucket for cleaning the outhouse. Put it on, he said, and fix your hair. She wanted to throw it in his face. She put it on. Because the dress deserved better than her anger. Because somewhere in the stitching of those red peonies was her mother's hands, and she wasn't going to let this morning take that from her too. Chen Bingwen set up near the front of Dust Haven's main street in the open space between the feed store and the dry goods, where the dust was thickest and the shade was non-existent. It was not yet 8 in the morning, and the heat was already vicious. Rose stood where she was told to stand. She held herself straight. Her hands were at her sides, fingers loose, though every instinct in her body was screaming at her to run. She had nowhere to run to. She had no money, No horse, no English beyond the fragments she'd pieced together over years of listening at doorways. She had the red cloth pouch from her mother tied inside the bodice of the dress pressed against her ribs, and that was everything she owned in the world. The crowd gathered the way crowds do in small towns, slowly then all at once. Men mostly. Cowboys just in from the range, still dusty from the trail. The man who ran the feed store leaned against his doorframe with his arms crossed, watching with the lazy interest of someone who'd seen too much to be shocked by anything. A group of younger men near the water trough were passing a canteen and snickering. Rose looked at the horizon. Past the rooftops, past the scrub oak on the ridge, into the hard blue distance where the sky met the earth. She fixed her eyes there, and kept them there. Don't look at them, she told herself. Don't give them the satisfaction. Her father had begun talking. She understood enough to follow the shape of it. Good worker, strong, quiet. No trouble the way a man describes a horse he's trying to get rid of before anyone notices it's going lame. Her brother stood slightly behind him, arms crossed, grinning at nothing in particular, performing amusement for an audience that wasn't looking at him anyway. A man pushed through the edge of the crowd. Heavy-set, wearing a vest, with the buttons straining a cigar stub, clamped in the corner of his mouth, that had probably been there since yesterday. This was Harold Stokes. Rose had heard that name before. She'd heard it the way you hear about weather coming in from the west, as something to fear, something you can't stop. Stokes looked at her the way he would look at a saddle he was thinking about buying, assessing, calculating, entirely absent of anything resembling human recognition. How old? He asked her father. 26, Chen said. Stokes made a sound that wasn't quite a word. He took the cigar stub out of his mouth, examined it, put it back. That's old, he said. She's healthy, her father said quickly. Works hard, never complains. Where'd she come from? Born here, raised here. She speak English. Chen hesitated just a fraction of a second too long. Enough. Stokes looked at Rose directly for the first time. Say something, he said to her. Rose looked back at him. She said nothing. Not because she couldn't, not because she was afraid, but because something in her, the same stubborn, quiet thing that had kept her pressing her nails into her palm in the dark, refused to perform for Harold Stokes, refused to open her mouth and produce words on command like a trained bird. Let him think what he wanted. She would not give him this. Stokes turned back to her father. $15, he said. She can work the laundry operation I'm setting up in Galveston, if she survives the trip. He said this last part with a particular kind of ease, the ease of a man who has said similar things before and suffered no consequences for them. If she doesn't, well, the road between here and there is long and hot. Wei laughed. The sound was small and sharp and landed on Rose's skin like a slap. Deal, her father said. And Rose thought, this is how it ends. Not with a fight, not with a last word, just like this. On a Tuesday morning in the dust in my mother's dress. She pressed her thumbnail into her palm. Still here, still breathing. And then she heard the horse. It wasn't dramatic the way it happened. That was the thing that Rose would think about later in quieter times, that she had always imagined rescue, if it ever came, would look like something out of the stories her mother used to tell. Thunder. Fire. A voice like a bell cutting through the noise. But the horse just walked in, a big roan gelding moving at an easy walk, its rider sitting loose and unhurried in the saddle, like a man coming back from an errand rather than arriving at anything in particular. He was tall. Rose could tell that even with him mounted, wide through the shoulders. A battered brown hat pulled low against the morning glare, shading a face she couldn't fully read at this distance. He pulled the horse up at the edge of the gathering and looked around the way a man does when he's walked into a room and is trying to understand what kind of room it is before he decides whether to stay. His eyes moved across the crowd, across Stokes, across Chen and Wei. And then they found Rose. She didn't know why that mattered. She didn't know this man. She had never seen him before in her life, but there was something in the way he looked at her, not the way Stokes had, not the way the men near the water trough were looking, something that was simply present. Like he was actually seeing her, Rose the person, and not whatever category she'd been filed under by everyone else in this square. He swung down from the horse. He was even taller standing. He walked toward the front, not hurrying, not performing, just moving with the quiet certainty of a man who generally gets where he's going. He stopped a few feet from Stokes and Chen, close enough to be part of the conversation, and far enough that it wasn't a threat. Not yet. "Morning," he said. His voice was low, unhurried. A Texas voice worn smooth by years of weather. "Somebody want to tell me what's happening here?" "Private business," Stokes said flatly. "Doesn't look private," the man said. He glanced at the crowd, then back at Stokes, then at Chen. "Looks like you're selling somebody." "That is correct," Chen said carefully. "My daughter. She is—" "I heard what she is," the man said, and his voice hadn't changed in volume or temperature, but something in it had shifted, something that made the man from the feed store straighten up against his doorframe. "I'm asking what gives you the legal right to do it." Stokes took the cigar stub out of his mouth. "Friend, I don't know who you are, but this doesn't concern you. Step off." The man looked at him for a long moment. "My name is Eli Thorne," he said. "I run the spread north of the creek, which means I am a tax-paying resident of this county, which means I have a direct interest in whether the laws of this state are being followed in this town." He paused. "You got a bill of sale, a legal contract, anything at all that makes this something other than what it looks like?" Stokes's jaw tightened. "It's a labor arrangement. With a woman who didn't sign anything. Her father is not her," Eli said. "Simple, flat, final, Texas law. She's 26 years old. Her father doesn't own her." A beat of silence. Rose realized she had stopped breathing. Wei took a step forward. "You got no business here, cowboy. Walk away." Eli turned and looked at Wei with an expression that Rose would later struggle to describe. It wasn't anger. It wasn't contempt. It was something colder and more complete, the expression of a man who has already finished an argument in his head and found himself thoroughly unimpressed with the other side. "Son," Eli said quietly, "I'm going to ask you to take a step back." Wei didn't move. Eli didn't move either. The gelding shifted its weight behind him, and somewhere across the street a door creaked open, and the sound of the crowd changed, not louder, but different, the way a crowd sounds when it realizes it might be watching something with actual consequences. Wei stepped back. Eli turned to Rose. And this was the moment she would return to for the rest of her life. Not the dramatic gestures, not the raised voices, not even what happened afterward. Just this. Just a man in a dusty hat standing in the middle of a Texas street, looking at her like she was a person with a choice to make. "Ma'am," he said, "I'm not going to tell you what to do, but if you want to leave, I'll ride you out of here right now. No conditions. No—" He paused, and she could see him picking the word carefully. "No obligations." Rose looked at her father. Chen was watching Eli with a calculating expression, the way he watched everything, measuring, assessing, waiting to see which way the wind was blowing before he committed to a direction. He didn't look at Rose. He hadn't looked at Rose once during this entire exchange. She looked at Wei, who was examining a spot on the ground near his boot with great interest. She looked at Stokes, who was watching Eli with the particular expression of a man doing math in his head about whether this fight was worth its probable cost. She looked back at Eli Thorne. He was still watching her, waiting. "Yes," Rose said. Her voice came out steady. She hadn't expected that. She'd expected it to shake. It had every right to shake. But it came out steady as the ground under her feet, and she thought, maybe that's who I am. Maybe I just needed someone to ask me properly. "Yes," she said again, louder, so that everyone in the square could hear it. "I want to leave." Her father found his voice then. "She is my daughter," Chen said, stepping forward, and Rose heard in his voice something she hadn't expected. Not anger, not calculation, but something that might almost have been desperation. "You cannot simply—" "Mr. Chen," Eli said, and he didn't raise his voice, not once, not ever. "Your daughter just told you herself. You heard her same as I did." He reached into the breast pocket of his shirt, pulled out a folded piece of paper, and held it out to Chen. "That's a bill of sale for the north tract of your land. I was coming here to finish that deal today anyway. Sign it, take the money, and let her go. You'll have enough to make it to San Francisco, and then some." Chen stared at the paper. Wei stared at it. The whole square seemed to hold its breath. "She is—" Chen started. "Papa," Rose said. He looked at her. For the first time that morning, he actually looked at her. Rose met his eyes. She kept her face still. She let him see her, not the 26-year-old problem, not the unmarried daughter, not the financial liability. Just her. His daughter. The woman his wife had loved. "Let me go," she said quietly. In Chinese, so only he could hear it, and it wouldn't be a performance for the crowd. "You don't have to say it was right. You don't have to say you're sorry. Just let me go." Something moved behind her father's eyes. She would never know, not for certain, whether it was guilt or relief or grief or simply the practical recognition that the argument was already lost. She would spend a long time not knowing, and eventually she would make her peace with not knowing. Chen took the paper from Eli's hand. He signed it. He took the money. He didn't say goodbye. He turned and walked back toward the house, and Wei followed him after a moment's hesitation, and that was that. 14 years of her life, and it ended with a signature in the dust. Eli held out his hand to help her up onto the horse. She looked at it for a moment. His hand calloused and scarred knuckles permanently darkened with the kind of dirt that doesn't wash out, and she thought of all the hands that had been extended toward her in her life, and what they had wanted in return. "My name is Rose," she said. "I know," he said. "I heard your father say it. You said no conditions." "Yes, ma'am. I am going to hold you to that." Something shifted at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile. More like the acknowledgement that a thing had been said and received and was being taken seriously. "Good," he said. "You should." She took his hand. She got on the horse. They rode out of Dust Haven without looking back, and the crowd parted for them in silence, and Rose Chen gripped the back of a stranger's saddle with both hands and looked straight ahead into the copper sky and did not cry. Not because she wasn't sad, not because she wasn't afraid, but because the thing pressing against her ribs, the red cloth pouch, her mother's hands, the jasmine and the peonies, and the woman who had seen something in her worth, keeping that thing felt suddenly powerfully like it was pointing her forward. Forward, it seemed to say. Not back. Never back. They rode north. For the first mile, neither of them spoke. The heat was already building toward its midday peak, and the scrub grass on either side of the trail was the particular pale gold of things that have decided to survive the summer by going very still and waiting it out. A hawk circled somewhere overhead. A horned lizard watched them pass from the top of a fence post and then disappeared. Rose was aware of everything. The saddle leather under her, the rhythm of the horse's gait, the width of Eli's shoulders in front of her, the fact that she was riding away from the only home she'd ever known with a man whose last name she'd only learned 20 minutes ago. She was also aware that she didn't feel afraid. Unsettled, yes. Uncertain, absolutely. But not afraid. And that was strange enough to notice. "Where are we going?" she asked. "My place," Eli said. 4 miles north. You can see the sugarberry grove from the creek crossing." "I've never been north of the feed store," Rose said. A pause. "Never. My father didn't see the need." Eli said nothing to that for a moment. Then, "How long have you been in Dust Haven?" "Since I was 8. 18 years, he said, and his voice was careful, not pitying, just counting. "And never past the feed store?" "No." Another silence. The trail curved around a stand of live oaks, and briefly the shade fell over them, and the difference was so immediate and so merciful that Rose nearly made a sound. "You'll have your own room," Eli said. "Locks from the inside." "You said no conditions." "That's not a condition. That's just—" He seemed to think about how to finish the sentence. "That's just the way it should be." Rose said nothing. She was trying to remember the last time someone had used the phrase, "the way it should be," in reference to something that was meant to benefit her rather than manage her. She couldn't remember. "I don't know you," she said. "I need you to understand that I understand that. I don't know you, and I'm not going to pretend this isn't—" She stopped. She didn't have the English for the end of that sentence. "Strange," he offered. "Strange," she agreed. "Yes. It is strange," Eli said simply. "I won't tell you it isn't. But strange things happen in this country every day, and some of them are bad and some of them aren't. This morning back there—" He paused. "That was bad. What happens next doesn't have to be." Rose looked at the back of his hat. "Why did you stop?" she asked. "This morning. You came to buy land. You didn't have to stop." The hat didn't move. The horse kept walking. "No," Eli said after a long enough pause that she'd started to think he wasn't going to answer. "I didn't have to." "Then why—" Another pause. Shorter this time. "Because you were pressing your fingernails into your palm," he said. "And nobody else was looking." Rose stared at the back of his hat. Her right hand, the one that wasn't gripping the back of the saddle, opened slowly. There were 4 small crescents pressed into the skin of her palm, red-edged, not quite deep enough to bleed. She closed her fingers around them. "You noticed that," she said quietly. "I notice things," Eli said. It wasn't boastful. It was just a fact stated the way you state your name or the county you live in. It's a habit. Most people wouldn't have. Most people weren't looking, he said again. And there was something in his voice now. Something that had not been there before. Not quite heaviness, but weight. The weight of someone who has had reasons to notice things that other people miss. That doesn't make it all right. It just makes it what it was. Rose turned that over. They rode on. The ranch came into view around a bend in the creek. A clean, low-slung house, built from cedar and limestone, with a porch running the full length of the front, and a kitchen garden in the side yard that looked like it was being kept alive through sheer stubbornness in the Texas heat. There was a barn solid and well-maintained, a chicken coop, a corral with 4 horses that looked up as they approached and then went back to being horses. It was not grand, but it was real, built by someone who intended to stay. Eli swung down and held the gelding steady for Rose. She got down on her own, and her feet hit the hard-packed earth, and she stood there for a moment, just feeling solid ground under her, not moving. "It's not much," Eli said, watching her from the other side of the horse. "I know that." "It's real," Rose said. He looked at her. "Yeah," he said. "It is." He led the gelding to the corral, and Rose stood in the yard and looked at the house and the garden and the hard blue sky over the limestone ridge, and she felt for the first time in a very long time that she was standing somewhere that might not require her to be small. She didn't know what came next. She didn't know this man. She didn't know this land. She didn't know what the word home was going to mean now that she'd had it taken away, and then had it maybe offered back in a form she hadn't expected. But she was here, still breathing, still standing, and the red cloth pouch pressed against her ribs, and somewhere in it, in the jasmine memory of her mother's hands, something that had been very quiet for a very long time, seemed to lean forward, the way a flame leans into a wind, and whisper, "Start here. Start from this." Rose Chen pressed her feet into the hot Texas earth. She started. The first thing Rose did when Eli showed her the room was check the lock. She didn't do it subtly. She didn't pretend she was doing something else. She walked straight to the door, slid the bolt across, heard the clean, solid click of it, and stood there with her hand on the iron for a long moment before she let go. Eli watched from the doorway without comment. "It works," she said. "Yes, ma'am." She turned around. The room was small: a bed, a chest of drawers, a hook on the wall, a window that looked out toward the creek. It smelled like cedar shavings and dry heat, and the faint ghost of someone's pipe tobacco from a long time ago. Nothing fancy, nothing soft, nothing she had to share with anyone who didn't knock first. "Thank you," she said. He nodded once, started to turn away. "Mr. Thorne?" He stopped. "I need to know what you expect from me," Rose said. She kept her voice level, because she had made a decision sometime during that 4-mile ride that she was going to say the hard things out loud every time before they had a chance to grow into assumptions she hadn't agreed to. "You said no conditions. I want to understand what that means. Because in my experience, no conditions means the conditions haven't been said yet." Eli turned back around fully. He leaned one shoulder against the doorframe and looked at her with that same unhurried attention she'd noticed in the square, the look of a man who was actually listening instead of just waiting for her to finish. "It means what it sounds like," he said. "I'm not running a debt system here. You don't owe me for the ride. You don't owe me for the room. You're not here to pay anything off." "Then what am I here for?" "That's up to you." Rose studied him. "That's not an answer." "Yeah, it is," Eli said. "It just might be the first time somebody's given it to you." She didn't have a response to that. Not an honest one, anyway. "I'll cook," she said finally. "And I'll earn my keep. Not because I owe you, because I don't take things I haven't worked for." Something moved briefly in his expression, not quite surprise, more like recognition. "All right," he said. "And if that changes, if the conditions change, I want you to tell me before they do." "Fair enough." "And I want to learn English, properly, not just enough to get by." Now he did look slightly surprised. "I can do that." "Good." Rose turned back to the window, signaling that the conversation was over. "Then we understand each other." She heard him push off the doorframe and walk back down the hall. She heard the front door open and close, and through the window she watched him cross the yard toward the barn with the same easy, unhurried stride, and she thought either this man is exactly what he appears to be, or he is the most patient liar she has ever encountered. She supposed she was about to find out which. She reached into the bodice of the dress and pulled out the red cloth pouch. She held it for a moment, just held it, feeling the small hard shapes inside the lotus seed, the fishbone, the thread. "I don't know what I'm doing, Mama," she said quietly to the room, to the pouch, to whatever was left of Mei Ling Chen in the space between the living and the dead. "But I'm still here." She tucked the pouch back. She smoothed the front of the wedding dress. Then she went to find the kitchen. It took her approximately 4 minutes to understand that Eli Thorne lived like a man who had stopped caring about the details of his own life somewhere around the same time he stopped caring about living indoors. The kitchen was clean in the structural sense, no rotting food, no pest situation she could identify, but the organization defied comprehension. Cornmeal where the coffee should be. Coffee where the salt should be. 3 cast iron pans in 3 different locations, none of which were near the stove. A half-empty jar of molasses on top of a stack of letters. The letters had a ring-shaped stain on the top one. Rose stood in the middle of it and breathed through her nose. "I moved some things," came Eli's voice from the back door, and she turned to find him there, hat off now, watching her survey the damage with an expression that might have been the beginning of an apology. "It probably doesn't make sense." "It makes no sense at all," Rose said. "I know where everything is." "Do you?" "Mostly." "Where is your salt?" A pause. "It's—" He looked toward the shelf by the window, then toward the shelf by the stove. "It's somewhere." Rose found the salt in a tin next to the axle grease on the back porch. She brought it inside without a word, placed it on the counter next to the stove, and started moving things. Not asking permission. Not explaining. Just organizing the kitchen. The way a kitchen needed to be organized, with the logic of someone who had spent years cooking under conditions that required everything to be exactly where you'd left it, because you couldn't afford to waste motion searching. Eli sat down at the table and watched her do it. "You can tell me to stop," Rose said, not looking up from where she was sorting the spice jars. "I'm not going to tell you to stop. I'm changing things. I can see that. It'll be harder to find things for a few days until you learn the new arrangement. I'll manage." Rose stopped. She turned and looked at him across the kitchen, this large, quiet man sitting at his own table, watching her rearrange his life with what appeared to be genuine equanimity, and she said, "Most men would be angry." "I reckon most men would rather have someone who knows what they're doing fix a problem than sit there pretending the problem isn't there," Eli said. She looked at him another moment. Then she turned back to the spice jars. "That's a reasonable position," she said. "Thank you. I wasn't complimenting you. I was acknowledging your logic." A beat of silence. Then very quietly she heard him exhale not quite a laugh, but the shape of one. She kept her back to him so he wouldn't see that she was doing the same. That evening, she made rice congee with the dried salt pork she found in the larder, and the ginger she'd pulled from the kitchen garden. Someone had planted ginger, which surprised her, and she filed that question away for later. She brought 2 bowls to the table and sat down across from Eli without ceremony, because she had decided she was done with the performance of making herself small at mealtimes. Eli looked down at the bowl. "What is it?" "Congee. My mother's recipe." She picked up her spoon. "If you don't like it, there's cornbread." He picked up his spoon. He took a bite. He was quiet for a moment, not the silence of politeness, but the silence of actually tasting something. "It's good," he said. "I know." Another almost laugh. "You always like this." "Like what?" "Sure of yourself." Rose considered the question honestly. "No," she said. "Not always. But I've decided to practice." Eli looked at her across the table, and there was something in his face she hadn't seen directed at her before. Not pity, not calculation, not the assessing look of a man wondering what she was worth. Just something steady and open that she didn't quite have a word for. "Good," he said. "Keep practicing." She ate her congee. Outside, the Texas evening was cooling to something almost bearable, and the cicadas had started up their long electric song, and Rose Chen sat at a stranger's table in her dead mother's wedding dress and thought, "This is the first meal I've eaten in 14 years where no one at the table needed something from me." She thought she might need a minute to understand what to do with that. She finished her congee instead. 3 days passed before the first real trouble came. Not trouble from outside, not Chen, not Wei, not Stokes. That trouble was still out there, she knew, patient as a drought waiting for its moment. The trouble that came first was smaller and more personal, and in some ways harder to defend against. It came in the form of a woman named Dolores Hatch. Rose was in the kitchen garden pulling weeds from around the tomato plants when she heard the horses come up the drive. 2 of them, both well-kept, both carrying women who sat their saddles with the particular ease of people who had been riding since before they could walk. The first woman was perhaps 50, silver-haired, with the kind of handsome, weathered face that comes from spending a life outdoors. The second was younger, maybe 30, with red hair and watchful eyes. The older woman looked down at Rose. "You're the Chinese girl," she said. Not unkindly exactly, but without any preliminary warmth either. The statement of a fact being confirmed. "I'm Rose Chen," Rose said. "Dorothy Hatch," the woman said. "My spread borders Eli's to the east, and this is my daughter-in-law Clara." A pause. "We heard what happened in town." Rose stood up from the garden brush, the dirt from her hands, and looked up at Dorothy Hatch with steady eyes. "What did you hear?" "That Eli Thorne rode into the square and took a Chinese woman away from her father." Dorothy's expression hadn't changed. "That's what people are saying." Is that what Eli said? Haven't talked to Eli yet. Came to see for myself first. Dorothy's eyes moved over Rose slowly, the way an experienced woman reads a situation. You're wearing a wedding dress. It was all I had when I left. Are you and Eli? No, Rose said. We are not anything. He offered me a place to stay. I accepted. That is the entirety of the situation. Dorothy looked at her for another long moment. Then she looked at her daughter-in-law. Something passed between them, the compressed language of women who have known each other long enough to conduct entire conversations in glances. Come inside, Dorothy said finally. I'd like to talk to you properly. You're talking to me now. I mean, without the garden between us. Rose looked at her hands still dusty and thought about the 4 things she had decided since yesterday: to say the hard things out loud, to eat at the table, to learn English, and to stop apologizing for taking up space. All right, she said. I'll make tea. They sat at the kitchen table. Dorothy, Clara, and Rose and Dorothy Hatch drank her tea in the careful way of a woman who had been brought up to be polite, regardless of her feelings, and then she set her cup down and said, This town is going to talk about you. I expect so, Rose said. It's not going to be kind. I've survived unkind before. Not like this, Dorothy said, and her voice shifted, then the neutrality dropping just slightly to reveal something underneath that Rose recognized after a moment as genuine concern. You're Chinese. You're living alone with a man who isn't your husband. Out here, that's going to... Dorothy, Clara said softly. She needs to know, Dorothy said. She already knows, Clara said. She was looking at Rose with those watchful eyes. Don't you? Yes, Rose said. I know. She turned her teacup in her hands. I also know that I had 2 choices this morning. Go back to my father or stay here. I chose here. Whatever comes from that choice, I'll meet it. Dorothy was quiet for a moment. Then she said, You're braver than you look. I'm not brave, Rose said. I'm just out of other options. Dorothy looked at her for a long moment. Then something cracked open in the older woman's face, not much. Not dramatic, just a small fracture in the careful wall, and she said, My husband died 11 years ago and left me with 400 acres and 3 boys who thought they knew better than me about everything. I wasn't brave either. She picked up her tea. I was just out of other options. Rose looked at her. Clara looked at both of them. I'll send over some clothes, Dorothy said briskly, in the voice of a woman who has decided something and is moving forward before sentiment can complicate it. You can't keep wearing that dress. It's impractical. I'm aware, Rose said. And if anyone in town gives you trouble, Dorothy stopped. Started again. Eli Thorne is a good man, but one good man isn't always enough. You need people who'll speak up when he's not there. She set down her cup. I've been speaking up in this county for 30 years. I'm reasonably good at it. Rose looked at her across the table, at this silver-haired woman who had ridden over to assess the situation and ended up almost despite herself extending something that looked a great deal like an offer of alliance. Why? Rose asked. Because I have a daughter, Dorothy said. And that was the end of the explanation. They didn't hug. They didn't make speeches. Dorothy finished her tea, stood up, and said she'd have the clothes sent over by Friday, and then she and Clara rode back down the drive, and Rose stood on the porch and watched them go. When she turned around, Eli was leaning against the fence post near the barn, arms crossed. How long have you been standing there? Rose asked. Long enough. You should have come in. Didn't need to. He uncrossed his arms and started back toward the barn. Seemed like you had it handled. She had, Rose realized. She had actually had it handled. She went back to the tomatoes. The first English lesson happened that same evening after the supper dishes were cleared, and the light through the window had gone the dark amber of late summer dusk. Eli put a piece of paper and a pencil on the table. Rose sat across from him. He wrote a word. What does that say? She asked. Home, he said. She looked at it. I know that word. Spell it back. She spelled it. H-O-M-E. Good. Now write it. She wrote it. Her handwriting was careful and deliberate, each letter formed with concentration. Good, Eli said. He wrote another word. Stay, he said. She spelled it. She wrote it. They went on like that for an hour, him writing her spelling and writing back, both of them quiet, except for the words themselves. The lesson was simple and unsentimental and efficient, and Rose found herself leaning forward over the paper with a hunger that surprised her. It wasn't just the words. It was the understanding that every word she learned was one less way someone could hide things from her in her own presence. Boundary? Eli said. She looked up. That's not a simple word. No, he said. It isn't. Why that one? He looked at her steadily. Because it's one you should be able to say, and understand when someone says it to you. She took the pencil. She wrote it slowly. B-O-U-N-D-A-R-Y. What does it mean? She asked, though she knew enough to guess. It means the line between what's yours and what isn't, Eli said, and the right to say which is which. Rose looked at the word on the paper for a long time. My father never taught me that word, she said finally. No, Eli said. I don't reckon he did. She wrote it again, larger this time, pressing the pencil harder into the paper. B-O-U-N-D-A-R-Y. Hers. The seventh day changed everything. Rose was at the creek washing the week's laundry when she heard the sound she had been dreading since she'd woken up on her first morning and thought they will come back. They will always come back until something makes them stop. Horses on the North Trail, 2 of them, coming fast. She stood up from the water's edge, wet hands still holding a half-wrung shirt. She looked toward the sound. It wasn't Chen or Wei. It was 2 men she didn't recognize, young mid-20s, wearing the particular combination of dust and attitude that she had learned to identify as trouble looking for a place to happen. They pulled their horses up on the bank above her and looked down. Well, said the one on the left, leaning forward on his pommel, with a grin that didn't reach anywhere near his eyes. Didn't know Thorne had hired himself a China girl. Rose didn't move. She looked at them. You lost? She asked. The man on the left laughed. The one on the right looked less amused and more interested, which was somehow worse. Nah, he said. We're neighbors. Harlan Cruz. That's my brother Dutch. We're on the spread south of here. Mr. Thorne isn't home, Rose said. We know, Harlan said. Saw him ride out toward the hatch place earlier. He swung down from his horse, casual hands loose. Thought we'd introduce ourselves to his new... He paused with theatrical deliberateness. Housekeeper. Rose set the wet shirt down on the rock beside her. She had no weapon, no one in earshot. Eli was 2 miles away, probably more. Dorothy Hatch's spread was 4 miles east, and it might as well have been 40. She had her hands. She had her feet. She had 4 years of watching her father negotiate with men who thought they had the upper hand, watching when to give ground, when to stand, when to let the other person believe they were winning right up until the moment they weren't. That's far enough, she said when Harlan had closed half the distance between them. He stopped. More surprised than intimidated, but still he stopped. I said we're neighbors, he said. And I said that's far enough, Rose said. Her voice was level. You want to talk, you can do it from there. Dutch, still mounted, was watching his brother now, instead of Rose, which meant he was waiting to see which way this went. That was useful. That meant he wasn't committed. You're going to tell me where I can stand on land that belongs to Eli Thorne? Yes, Rose said. I'm going to tell you exactly where you can stand. And right now you can stand right there and say whatever you came to say, or you can leave. Those are your choices. Harlan stared at her. The grin had gone somewhere uncertain. You got a mouth on you, he said. I do, Rose agreed. And I also know that Dorothy Hatch rode out here 6 days ago and told me that if I had trouble, She wanted to know about it. Mrs. Hatch is a woman who keeps her promises. Rose held Harlan's gaze without blinking. Do you want to find out if she keeps this one? Something shifted in the air. Dutch said from up on his horse, Harlan. Harlan looked at his brother. Dutch was shaking his head just slightly. Word of advice, Rose said while Harlan was still deciding. Go home. Come back when Mr. Thorne is here if you have actual business, but don't come back the way you came today. Harlan looked at her for another long moment. His jaw worked. Then he turned and put his boot back in the stirrup. Interesting housekeeper, he said, swinging up. Yes, Rose said. I am. They rode south. She watched them until they were out of sight. Then she sat down on the rock, put her wet hands on her knees, and breathed. In, out. Her heart was going at twice its normal pace, and her legs were not entirely steady. But she was here, she was upright, and they were gone. She finished the laundry. When Eli came back at sundown, she told him what had happened. Not breathlessly, not waiting for his reaction at each piece, just clearly start to finish the way you report a fact. He was quiet through the whole thing. When she finished, he looked at the table for a moment, then at her. You all right? He asked. Yes. You said the right things. I know. I should have. You weren't here, Rose said. I was. I handled it. She looked at him. That's how it works, isn't it? You handle what's in front of you. Something moved in his face. Something that looked almost like admiration. Though it was the quiet kind. The kind that doesn't announce itself. Yeah, he said. That's how it works. She went to start supper. He sat at the table. Rose, he said. She turned. I'm going to ride over to the cruise place tomorrow morning. His voice was steady, but she could hear something underneath it. Not anger exactly, but a kind of cold resolve, the temperature of a man who has decided something. Have a conversation with Harlan. He'll say I misread the situation. He can say whatever he wants. And then what? Eli looked at her. And then Harlan Cruz will know that what happens on this land and to the people on it is something I take personally. Rose held his gaze. You don't have to do that. I know I don't have to, Eli said simply. I'm going to. She turned back to the stove. Eli, she said to the pot she was lifting. Yeah. Thank you. He didn't say you're welcome. He didn't make a speech out of it. He just said, supper smells good, and got up to wash his hands at the basin, and that was the end of the conversation. But later that night, when the house was quiet and the only sound was the cicadas, and the distant creak, and the occasional shift of horses in the barn, Rose lay on her bed and looked at the ceiling, and thought about a man who had ridden across a county to tell another man that she mattered. Not because he owned her, not because she had earned it or asked for it or performed well enough to deserve it, just because it was the right thing. She had spent 26 years in a world where the right thing happened considerably less often than the wrong thing. She wasn't sure yet what to do with its sudden appearance. She pressed the red cloth pouch against her sternum and felt the small hard shapes through the fabric. You'll know her mother had told her once when she was very young, and asking about love in the abstract, the way children do. You'll know because it won't feel like something being taken. It'll feel like something being given back that you didn't know you'd lost. Rose pressed the pouch harder. She didn't know what to call this. Not yet. It was too new and too fragile, and she had learned the hard way what happened to things she reached for too quickly. But it was something. It was definitely something. She closed her eyes. For the second time since she'd arrived at Eli Thorne's ranch, she fell asleep without lying awake, first counting the ways things could go wrong. That by itself was extraordinary. What she didn't know, what she couldn't have known lying there in the cedar-smelling dark, was that 60 miles south, in a room above a Dust Haven saloon, Harold Stokes was sitting across a table from a man in a sharp black suit, and the man in the black suit had a piece of paper in front of him and a pen in his hand, and a very particular kind of patience. The North Tract land deal, the man was saying. You're telling me Thorne bought it outright. Paid cash, Stokes said. Same day he took the girl. The man in the suit tapped his pen against the table. And the girl, she's living out there. Far as I know. No formal arrangement. No contract. Stokes shrugged. None that I saw. The man in the suit smiled. It wasn't an unfriendly smile. That was the most dangerous kind. Then there's an argument, he said, that the transaction was never properly completed. Stokes leaned forward. What kind of argument? The man picked up his pen. The kind, he said, that a good lawyer can make sound very reasonable to a judge who doesn't ask too many questions. He started writing. Outside the saloon window, the Texas night was vast and hot, and full of the distant sounds of a country that was still deciding what its laws meant and who they were for, and 60 miles north. Rose Chen was sleeping soundly for the second night in a row, and she had no idea that something was already in motion. Something that was going to require everything she had. The letter arrived on a Friday. Rose was teaching herself to read the land deed Eli kept in the top drawer of his desk, working through each word, slowly using what she'd learned in 2 weeks of evening lessons when she heard the rider come up the drive. She didn't think anything of it. Riders came and went. That was the nature of a working ranch. Then Eli came inside with an envelope in his hand, and the particular stillness on his face that she had already learned meant something was wrong. "What is it?" she asked. He sat down at the table. He read the letter twice, and then he set it down flat and looked at her. "Stokes is filing a claim," he said. "He's got a lawyer in Austin. They're arguing that your father's sale to me was incomplete because—" He stopped. Started again. "Because you weren't a party to the transaction." Rose stared at him. "I wasn't a party to it because no one asked me." "I know that." "They're saying because I didn't sign anything the deal didn't legally transfer." "Yes. Which means they're saying they're saying," Eli said carefully, "that your status is legally unresolved." The room went very quiet. Rose picked up the letter. Her English was not good enough yet for all of it, but it was good enough for the words that mattered. Unresolved claim, legal standing, property rights. She put it back down. "They're going to try to take me," she said flatly. "They're going to try," Eli said. "They won't succeed." "How do you know that?" "Because I'm going to ride to Beaumont tomorrow and find a lawyer who's better than theirs. That takes money. I have money. Eli." "Rose." His voice was quiet, but it had that quality she'd heard once before when he'd told Harlan Cruz that what happened on this land was something he took personally. Final. Decided. Not a discussion. "This isn't your problem to solve alone. That's not how this works here." She looked at him across the table. This man who had known her for 14 days. This man who had rearranged his kitchen and taught her the word boundary and ridden over to the Cruz place the morning after the creek and come back without telling her exactly what was said, but with the certainty of a man who had made his position unmistakably clear. "Why are you doing this?" she asked. Not the way she'd asked it on the horse testing him. The real question. The one underneath. Eli was quiet for a moment. "Because it's right," he said. "That's not enough of an answer." He looked at her steadily. "Because you sat at my table and told me the conditions before there were any. Because you stood in that creek and told 2 men where they could and couldn't stand. Because you've been here 2 weeks and you've made this place—" He stopped. His jaw worked slightly. "Better?" he said. "You've made it better. And I'm not going to let some greedy man in a suit undo that because he's angry about a deal that fell through." Rose held his gaze. The clock on the mantel ticked. Outside, one of the horses in the corral stamped and blew. "All right," she said. "All right. All right. Go to Beaumont. Find your lawyer." She stood up and picked up the letter. "But I'm coming with you." Eli blinked. "Rose." "I am the subject of this claim," she said. "I am going to be present when the legal response to it is decided. I am not going to sit here and wait while 2 men decide my future in a room I'm not allowed into. She set the letter down on the desk. "I've done enough of that." A long pause. "You'll need different clothes," he said. "Dorothy sent clothes on Wednesday." Another pause. Then the corner of his mouth moved. "You planned this." "I planned for the possibility," Rose said. "There's a difference." They left at first light. The ride to Beaumont took most of a day, and for the first 2 hours they rode in comfortable silence, which was itself a thing Rose had not expected to find comfortable silence with another person. In her father's house, silence had always been loaded, always been the held breath before the next demand or the next disappointment. This silence was different. It had room in it. "Tell me about the lawyer you're looking for," she said. "His name is George Alderman," Eli said. "He handled the land dispute between the hatch spread and the county water board 3 years ago. Dorothy recommended him. Dorothy knows him. Dorothy knows everyone. And he'll take a case like this. He'll take any case that has the law on its side," Eli said. "That's what Dorothy says." "Does this case have the law on its side?" Eli was quiet for a moment. "The 1866 Civil Rights Act says you're a citizen. That gives you standing to contract independently. Stokes and his lawyer are betting on a judge who doesn't care about that. And if they find that judge, then we find a better argument." Rose thought about this. "You know a lot about the law." "I had reasons to learn," Eli said, and his voice shifted in that particular way it shifted when he was approaching territory he didn't usually cover. Rose had learned to notice that shift. She had also learned not to push it. He would get there when he got there. They rode another mile. "My wife," he said. "Clara. When she died, there was a dispute about the land. Her brother came down from Missouri and said she'd promised it to him. Said he had a letter." He kept his eyes on the trail. He didn't have a letter. He had a story he'd told himself so many times he believed it. "But I didn't know enough law to fight him the right way at first. Cost me 8 months and most of my savings before Alderman sorted it out." "You won." "I kept the land." "I'm sorry," Rose said. "About Clara." He nodded once, accepting it. "How long were you married?" 2 years and 4 months, he said. "She was—" He paused. "She was someone who made noise. Good noise. The house had sound in it when she was there. After she was gone, the quiet was—" He stopped again. "Wrong," he said. "It was the wrong kind of quiet." Rose thought about the cedar-smelling room with the window that looked toward the creek, the locked door, the way Eli had handed her a cup of coffee 6 days ago and sat across from her and not needed her to fill the silence. "Is it still the wrong kind?" she asked. He looked at her. The morning light was full on his face, and she could see everything in it, the careful consideration, the awareness of what the honest answer meant, the decision to give it anyway. "No," he said. "It isn't." She turned back to the trail. Her heart was doing something she instructed it firmly to stop doing. It didn't stop. George Alderman's office was on the 2nd floor above a hardware store reached by an exterior staircase that creaked on every step. He was a small, precise man with wire-rimmed glasses, and the kind of handshake that communicated he had absolutely nothing to prove. He read the letter from Stokes's lawyer in about 45 seconds, set it down, and looked at Rose over the top of his glasses. "You are Rose Chen," he said. "Yes." "And you are here of your own volition?" "Yes." "You were not coerced, compensated, or in any way induced to travel here today?" "No." He looked at Eli. "She answers for herself." "That's generally been my experience," Eli said. Alderman looked back at Rose. "Miss Chen, the argument Stokes's lawyer is making is technically clever and practically groundless, but it will require a response that addresses both the legal status of the original transaction and your own standing as an independent person, capable of making decisions about your own residence and labor. This means I will need to depose you. I will need you to testify in writing and possibly in person about the circumstances of your leaving your father's house." "I understand," Rose said. It will require you to describe events that were humiliating. They were humiliating whether I described them or not, Rose said. Describing them to someone who can use that description to prevent it from happening again is a different thing from the humiliation itself. Alderman looked at her for a moment over his glasses. Then he picked up his pen. "All right," he said. "Let's begin." They were in Alderman's office for 3 hours. Rose talked. Alderman wrote. Eli sat in the chair against the wall and said nothing, but she was aware of him the entire time, the way you are aware of a solid wall when you're leaning against it, not consciously, not constantly, but in the baseline, certainty that it was there. When it was over, Alderman set down his pen, flexed his fingers and said, "I'll file a response by the end of the week. Stokes is hoping for a quick resolution before anyone pays too much attention. We're going to make sure people pay attention." "What does that mean?" Rose asked. "It means I have a colleague at the Beaumont Gazette who covers civil matters," Alderman said. "A case where a wealthy land speculator is trying to legally reclassify a woman as property in 1879 is—" He paused. "Newsworthy." Rose went still. "You want to put this in a newspaper?" "I want Stokes to understand that the cost of pursuing this is not only legal fees," Alderman said. "Men like Stokes do not respond to principle. They respond to exposure." She looked at Eli. "Your call," he said. "Completely, absolutely, hers." She thought about her father signing his name on a piece of paper without looking at her. She thought about Harlan Cruz on the creek bank. She thought about the man in the black suit with his pen and his patience and his particular kind of smile. She thought about every time in her life that someone had made a decision about her in a room she wasn't in, and how different this moment was that she was in the room, that she had been asked that the answer was hers to give. "Do it," she said. Alderman nodded and made a note. They rode home in the early dark, the stars coming out one at a time over the flat Texas sky. Rose was tired in the deep, specific way of someone who has spent hours being honest about painful things. It was a different kind of tired than fear or hunger or physical work. It had a cleanliness to it. "You did well in there," Eli said. "I told the truth," Rose said. "That's not the same as doing well." "Sometimes it is," he said. "When telling the truth costs something, it's the same." She thought about that. "What does it cost you, all of this?" "Lawyer's fees," Eli said. "Eli." He was quiet. The horses moved steadily under them. "It costs me the quiet life I came up here to have," he said at last, "which I reckon I didn't actually want as much as I thought I did." He paused. "Turns out, a quiet life and a lonely life are not the same thing either. I'd been using one word when I meant the other for about 3 years. Rose looked at the stars. She was thinking about her mother's red cloth pouch. She was thinking about the word her mother had used for the feeling when something broken begins slowly to mend. Not healed, not fixed, but the first movement toward. The Chinese word for it had no good English translation. The closest she'd found was becoming. She was becoming something. She didn't know what yet. But it was moving, and it was forward, and for the first time in her life, the direction felt chosen rather than assigned. They were 2 miles from the ranch when Eli said without preamble, "There's a light on the porch." She looked. He was right. A lamp burning. They hadn't left a lamp burning. Eli's hand moved to the rifle in the scabbard. His whole body changed, not tense, not dramatic, just alert, the shift of a man who spent years reading landscapes and had just read one that didn't add up. "Stay close," he said quietly. "What is it?" "Don't know yet." They came up the drive at a walk. The figure on the porch resolved out of the lamplight slowly, and Rose felt the cold move through her before her mind had fully processed what her eyes were seeing. It was Wei. Her brother was sitting on the porch steps with his elbows on his knees and his hat in his hands, and an expression she had never seen on his face before. Not the sneer, not the calculation. something smaller and less defended. He stood when he saw them. "I need to talk to you," he said. He was looking at Rose, only at Rose. "Just you, please." Rose looked at Eli. He was watching Wei with the careful attention of a man deciding whether a situation required his rifle or his patience. "Eli," Rose said quietly. He looked at her. "Give us a minute." A beat. Then he swung down, took both horses, and walked them toward the barn without another word. Rose watched him go. Then she turned back to her brother. She did not move toward him. She did not speak first. Wei looked at his hat, at the porch boards, at some middle distance she couldn't identify. "Father is sick," he said. Rose said nothing. "It happened fast, 3 weeks after we left for San Francisco." He swallowed. "He's asking for you." The silence stretched. "Why?" Rose said. "Because you're his daughter." "I was his daughter when he sold me." Wei flinched. It was small and quick, but she saw it. "I know that." "Do you?" Rose said. "Because I didn't hear you say anything that morning on the square. I didn't hear you say anything when Stokes talked about the road to Galveston being long and hot." Wei said nothing. His jaw was tight. "I have been waiting," Rose said, "for 14 years for one person in that house to say something. To say this is wrong. This is not right. She is ours, and we are treating her wrong." She took one step toward him. "Did you say it ever once when no one else was there to hear?" Wei looked at her. His eyes were wet, which she had not expected, and the unexpectedness of it made something crack open in her chest that she immediately clamped down on, because she was not ready for that yet. She was not going to cry for him on her own porch. "No," he said. "I didn't." "Then why are you here?" "Because he's asking for you," Wei said again, and his voice broke on the last word, just slightly, just enough to reveal that beneath all the years of sneer and swagger was a man who was watching his father die and was frightened and had no idea how to be that without some version of his family around him. Rose looked at her brother for a long time. She thought about what Eli had said on the ride back from Beaumont. Turns out a quiet life and a lonely life are not the same thing. She thought about how a person could spend years believing they wanted one thing and actually be running from another. She thought about her mother. "I'll think about it," she said finally. Wei looked up. "I am not saying yes," Rose said clearly. "I am saying I will think about it. Because what you're asking me is not simple, and I will not pretend that it is." She looked at him steadily. "You can sleep in the barn tonight. There's a bedroll on the second peg. In the morning, I'll give you my answer." She turned and walked into the house. She went to her room. She slid the bolt. She sat on the edge of the bed in the dark and held the red cloth pouch in both hands and did not make a sound for a very long time. She thought about forgiveness, what it was, what it wasn't, whether it was something you did for the other person or something you did for yourself, and whether the difference mattered if the outcome was the same. She thought about the word becoming. She was still thinking when the night deepened around her, and the cicadas rose and fell, and somewhere in the barn her brother was sleeping, and 60 miles south, a lawyer in a black suit was writing things in a room she wasn't in, and tomorrow was going to require more of her than she had yet been asked to give. But she was here, still breathing. She pressed the pouch against her heart and waited for morning. Morning came the way mornings do after sleepless nights, not gradually, not kindly, but all at once, the light through the window going from black to gray to the hard gold of a Texas summer, without any of the soft stages in between. Rose had not slept. She had sat on the edge of her bed for most of the night and turned the question over and over until it had worn smooth in her hands, and by the time the first rooster sounded from the direction of the hatch spread, she had her answer. She wasn't certain it was the right answer. She wasn't sure there was a right answer. But it was hers, and it was honest, And after 26 years of other people making her decisions, she had decided that honest and hers was going to have to be enough. She unbolted the door and walked to the kitchen. Eli was already there. Coffee on the stove, 2 cups on the table, the same way every morning for the past 2 weeks, as if he had decided early on that this was simply how mornings worked now and had seen no reason to revise the position. He looked up when she came in. He read her face the way he read everything quietly and completely. "You didn't sleep," he said. "No." "You made a decision." "Yes." He poured the coffee and waited. Rose sat down. She wrapped her hands around the cup and felt the heat move into her palms and said, "I'm going to go." Eli was still. "I'm going to see my father," she said. "Not because he deserves it, not because Wei deserves it, because I need to look at him one more time and know that I chose to be there, that I wasn't kept away by fear or anger, that whatever happens after I went because I decided to go." She looked up. "Do you understand the difference?" "Yes," Eli said. "I do. I need you to understand it's not forgiveness. Not yet. Maybe not ever. I don't know what it is yet." "You don't have to know what it is," Eli said. "You just have to know what you're doing and why." She looked at him. "Will you come with me?" Something moved across his face. Not surprise, not reluctance, but something careful and open, like a door that hadn't been used in a long time, being tested on its hinges. "Yeah," he said. "I'll come." Wei was sitting outside the barn when they came out, hat already in his hands, performing the patience of a man who had spent the night preparing himself for a no. When he saw Rose's face, he stood up, and when she said simply, "We leave in an hour," something broke open in his expression that he covered quickly the way people cover things they don't know how to carry in front of others. He nodded. He went to saddle his horse. Eli stood beside Rose and said quietly so only she could hear, "You sure—" "No," Rose said, "but I'm going anyway." The ride to Dust Haven was 3 hours of heat and silence and the complicated arithmetic of families which never adds up the way it's supposed to. Wei rode ahead, giving them space, which was either courtesy or the inability to look his sister in the face for 3 hours straight. Rose rode beside Eli and didn't say much, and he didn't push her to, and she was grateful for that, in the specific way you are grateful for things you didn't know to ask for. They were an hour out when Wei pulled up suddenly and turned his horse around. His face had changed. The practiced blankness was gone. What was underneath it was something raw and unsteady, and Rose recognized it because she had worn the same expression in the dark of her room for years without ever showing it to anyone. "I need to tell you something," Wei said. "Before we get there." Rose waited. "Father didn't plan the sale," Wei said. "Not at first." He looked at his hands on the reins. "It was my idea." The world didn't stop. The horses kept moving, the heat kept pressing, the cicadas kept their indifferent electric song. But something in Rose went very still and very cold in a way that had nothing to do with the temperature. "What?" she said. One word, flat as a plank. "We needed money for the crossing to San Francisco. Father didn't want to leave you behind. He wanted to bring you." Wei's voice was tight, the words coming out like they were being pulled rather than offered. "I told him you'd slow us down. I told him you were past marrying age, and you'd never bring in money, and we'd spend the whole crossing feeding someone who contributed nothing." He swallowed hard. "I made the argument. For weeks. I wore him down." Rose stared at her brother. "He believed me," Wei said. "In the end, he believed me because it was easier than fighting me, because I was his son, and he'd always given me what I pushed for, and I—" His voice broke. He pressed his lips together and got it back. "I told myself it was practical, that you'd be fine, that someone would take you in. I told myself a lot of things." Eli had gone completely still beside Rose, not reaching for anything, not intervening, just present. "Why are you telling me this now?" Rose said. "Because he's dying and he's been asking for you, and I need you to know that when you walk in there, Whatever he says, whatever apology he makes or doesn't make, the person who is most responsible for that morning in the square is me. Wei met her eyes for the first time directly without deflection. Not him, me. The silence was enormous. Rose looked at her brother. She looked at the man who had stood on a porch and laughed when Stokes talked about the road to Galveston being long and hot. She looked at him and tried to find the line between the cruelty she had witnessed and the fear she was witnessing now, and found that the line was thinner than she had wanted it to be, and that the thinness of it made everything harder and more human and more painful than simple hatred would have been. "I know," she said quietly. Wei looked up. "I knew then," Rose said. "Father would not have pushed so hard alone. He needed someone to give him permission." She kept her voice level. "You gave it to him." Wei nodded. One short, bleak movement. "I'm not going to tell you it's all right," Rose said. "It isn't. And I don't know if it ever will be." She paused. "But I'm still going. Because going is what I decided." She rode past him. After a moment she heard him follow. Dusthaven looked smaller than she remembered. That surprised her. She had expected it to feel large, looming the way places feel in memory when they've held pain. Instead, it looked like what it was, a small, hot Texas town, doing its best to exist in a landscape that didn't particularly care whether it succeeded. They rode straight to the house on the East End. The house Rose had grown up in. The house where her mother had died, and her father had decided she was furniture, and her brother had decided she was a liability. The house that had contained the whole shape of her life until 6 weeks ago. She got down from her horse. She did not hesitate at the door. She opened it and walked in. The smell hit her first. Not the smell of her childhood, the ginger and the rice water and the cedar chest where her mother kept the good cloth. The smell of sickness. Of a room that had been closed too long. Chen Bingwen was in the back room in the narrow bed, looking like a man who had been arguing with his own body for months and was finally losing. He was smaller than she remembered. That was always the thing about sick people. They shrank as if the illness was consuming not just the health, but the physical fact of them. He opened his eyes when she came in. For a long moment, he just looked at her. "Rose," he said. His voice had no force in it. She stood at the foot of the bed. She did not move closer. "I'm here." His eyes moved over her, taking inventory the way he had always taken inventory of things, assessing, measuring. But something in the assessment was different now. Something had changed in what he was looking for, or what he found. "You look well," he said. "I am well." "The rancher. His name is Eli Thorne," Rose said. "And yes, he treats me well." Her father closed his eyes briefly. When he opened them, the assessment was still there, but underneath it was something that looked tentatively and imperfectly like relief. "I made a mistake," he said. Rose said nothing. She was going to let him finish. "Not just the square," he said. "Not just Stokes." He paused. The breathing was effortful. "All of it. All the years of it. Your mother—" He stopped. "Your mother would have—" He couldn't finish that sentence either. "I know what she would have done," Rose said quietly. "She would have stood between you and me and refused to move. She always did." "Yes." The word barely made sound. "She's not here to do that anymore," Rose said. "She hasn't been for 14 years. She took one step closer. Not to comfort him. Just to be sure he could see her face clearly. "I'm not going to tell you that you're forgiven. I don't have that in me today. But I'm here. I came because I chose to come. That's what I can give you right now." Chen looked at her. "That's more than I deserve," he said. "Yes," Rose said. "It is." She pulled the chair to the side of the bed and sat down. She did not take his hand, but she stayed. She stayed for 2 hours. When she came out, Eli was sitting on the front step. He looked up. She sat down beside him without speaking, and he didn't say anything either for a long moment. And then he said, "How are you?" "I don't know yet," Rose said honestly. Ask me in a week. He nodded. Fair enough. Wei appeared in the doorway. His eyes were red, which he was making no effort to hide. He's sleeping, he said to Rose. The doctor says a few more days, maybe a week. Rose nodded. I'll stay, Wei said. You don't have to. I know I don't have to, Rose said. I'll come back tomorrow. Wei looked at her, then at Eli, then back at her with an expression that was trying to be hostile out of long habit, but couldn't quite manage it anymore. He doesn't have to come, he said, meaning Eli. He goes where I go, Rose said simply. That's how it works. Wei opened his mouth, closed it, and went back inside. Eli said nothing. But she felt his shoulder press slightly against hers, the small, solid weight of it. And she pressed back, and they sat on the step in the afternoon heat, and let the moment be what it was. They were halfway home when they met the sheriff. He was coming up the road toward Dusthaven on a gray horse, and he pulled up when he saw them with the particular expression of a man who has been looking for specific people and has found them in a location that is either convenient or inconvenient, depending on what happens next. Mr. Thorne, he said. His name was Calhoun. He was 50 lean, with the careful eyes of a man who had spent decades deciding which fights were worth having. Miss Chen. Sheriff, Eli said. Calhoun reached into his coat and pulled out a folded document. I've been riding out to your place. Saved me the trip. He held it out to Eli, too. Came in from Austin this morning. Judge Harriman ruled on the Stokes filing. Rose felt her whole body go tight. Eli took the document. He opened it. He read it. His face told her nothing. That was the worst part. Eli's face when he was reading something serious went completely neutral, and she had not yet learned to read what neutral meant for him in high-stakes moments. Eli, she said. He looked up, and then slowly the neutral broke, and what came through was something she hadn't seen on his face before in its full form. Not the almost smile, not the quiet recognition, something larger and less guarded. Alderman filed an emergency motion, he said. Got it in front of a different judge before Harriman could rule. Judge Reynolds out of Galveston. He looked at the document again as if confirming the words were still there. Stokes's claim is dismissed, ruled without legal merit. He looked at Rose. It's done. She stared at him. It's done, he said again. Calhoun cleared his throat. There's a note attached from Alderman. Says Stokes is considering an appeal, but his lawyer told him the Beaumont Gazette piece made that he checked the attached note strategically inadvisable. Rose looked at Calhoun. What did the Gazette piece say? Calhoun looked faintly uncomfortable in the way of a man who has opinions he's decided not to voice professionally. It said quite a lot, he said, about the events in the square 6 weeks ago and about the particular legal creativity being used to attempt to revisit those events. He paused. It named Stokes by name, and your father, and your brother. Wei's name in a newspaper attached to what had happened in the square. Rose sat with that for a moment. All right, she said. Calhoun tipped his hat, looked between them with those careful eyes and said, Glad it worked out, in a tone that managed to convey both professional neutrality and personal relief simultaneously. He rode on. Rose and Eli sat on their horses in the middle of the road. It's over, Eli said. One part of it, Rose said. The legal part. Yes, he looked at her. The rest of it takes longer. The rest of it takes the rest of my life, Rose said. But it started. That counts. They rode home. That evening Rose made the congee again. She had made it a dozen times in the past weeks, refining it each time. A little more ginger, the salt added at a different stage. The pork cut thinner. Eli had learned to eat it with the spoon held differently, and had stopped asking what was in it, which she had decided was a form of trust. They sat across the table from each other in the particular quiet of two people who have been through something together and are still in the early hours of realizing they're on the other side of it. Can I ask you something? Eli said. Yes. That pouch you carry. The red one. Rose looked at him. I saw you holding it last night. When you came out of your room. He paused. You don't have to tell me. It was my mother's, Rose said. She died when I was 12. This is everything she left me. She set her spoon down and reached into the bodice of the dress she still wore sometimes in the evenings, and pulled the pouch out. She set it on the table between them. Eli looked at it without touching it. What's inside? A lotus seed, a piece of dried fish bone, a thread. She paused. In China, when a daughter marries her mother, ties a red thread to her wrist before she goes to her husband's house, so she never feels alone. Eli was quiet. My mother died before she could do that for me, Rose said. She put the thread in here instead. I think she knew that things were not going to be simple for me. That I was going to need the reminder. What reminder? That she saw me, Rose said. That someone saw me and thought I was worth the work of caring for. She looked at the pouch. When everything else told me otherwise, I had this. Just this. The silence between them was different from all the silences before it. Fuller somehow. More weight to it, but not heavy the way good timber has weight without being a burden. Eli reached across the table, slowly. He didn't pick up the pouch. He just set his hand flat beside it, close, but not touching, and looked at her. I see you, he said. Simple, direct, no decoration. Rose looked at his hand, at the scarred knuckles and the permanent work dirt, and the steadiness of it just lying there, not grabbing, not demanding, simply present. She put her hand over his. She didn't say anything. There weren't words big enough for what the gesture meant, and she was not going to use small words for a large thing. He turned his hand over under hers and held on, and they sat there in the lamplight, with the kanji getting cold, and the cicadas outside doing their relentless summer chorus, and Rose Chen held the hand of a man who had chosen her for no reason, except that it was right, and felt something she had no English word for. The Chinese word was gui. It meant to return to the place you were always meant to be. She was still sitting with her hand in his when the sound came. Not horses this time. Something else. A knock, hard and fast at the front door. The kind of knock that doesn't wait to see if you're busy. Eli was on his feet before the second knock landed. Rose was right behind him. He opened the door. Dorothy Hatch stood on the porch, and her expression was the one Rose had not seen from her before, stripped of the careful social management, stripped of the authority and the competence and the 30 years of holding her ground. What was underneath all of that was plain fear. There's a fire, Dorothy said. The south line fence, and Eli... She stopped. Her eyes moved to Rose and back. Harlan Cruz was seen near your property line an hour ago. Eli went still in the specific way that meant he was already making decisions. How bad? He said. Bad enough, Dorothy said. My boys are already riding, but it's moving toward your north pasture. Rose looked at Eli. His jaw was set. His eyes had that cold, steady quality she had seen once before when he'd told the sheriff what had happened with Wei, and kept his voice level all the way through it. Get your coat, he said to her. You want me to stay? I want you where I can see you, he said. Cruz came back once. I'm not leaving you here alone, while he might still be on this land. She didn't argue. She got her coat. Dorothy was already back on her horse. Eli had his rifle and his horse in under 2 minutes. Rose mounted behind him without being asked. They rode hard into the dark toward the orange line on the horizon that was not the sunset, and Rose Chen with the red cloth pouch pressed against her ribs and the smell of smoke coming in fast on the hot Texas wind, held on to Eli Thorne's waist and thought, every time I think the worst is behind me, the land reminds me that the worst and the best of things don't arrive in order. They arrive together, always together. The fire was real. Harlan Cruz was real. And whatever came next on the other side of that orange horizon was going to be the thing that either proved everything she had built in the last 6 weeks could survive contact with the worst kind of human intention, or it wasn't. She held on tighter. The horse ran. The fire wasn't an accident. Rose knew it the moment she saw it up close, the way it was burning in 2 separate lines, moving toward each other. Not the random sprawl of a dry grass fire caught by wind, but something deliberate, something shaped by human intention. Eli saw it too. She felt it in the way his body went rigid in the saddle before he said a single word. Dorothy's sons were already working the south line with wet burlap sacks beating the ground in the particular rhythm of men who had done this before and knew exactly how much time they didn't have. The orange light made everything look violent and close. Eli swung down. "Rose, stay with the horses." "I can help. I need someone I trust with the horses," he said, and she understood from his tone that this was not about keeping her safe. It was about the horses being essential and him needing a person whose judgment he trusted absolutely watching them. She took the reins of both horses without another word. He grabbed a burlap sack from Dorothy's supply and ran toward the south line. Rose stood with the horses and watched the fire, and watched the men working, and watched the tree line beyond the fence where the darkness was complete and impenetrable, and she thought about Harlan Cruz. About Dutch, who had been on his horse that day at the creek, and shaken his head at his brother, not out of principle, but out of calculation. About what kind of man sets a fire on another man's land and then stands in the dark to watch. The kind who stays, she thought. That's the answer. He stayed to watch. She scanned the tree line. There. A small movement. The shift of a horse's weight, the faint outline of a man sitting still, trying to look like nothing. Rose tied both horses to the fence post. She walked toward the tree line. She knew it was not the rational thing to do. She knew Eli would say, "Don't." She walked anyway because Harlan Cruz in the dark watching this fire, and not knowing she'd seen him, was more dangerous than Harlan Cruz discovered and confronted. And she had learned from 6 weeks of watching Eli Thorne that the answer to a threat you can see is always better than the slow rot of a threat you've decided to ignore. She stopped 20 feet from the tree line and said clearly, "I see you." Silence. "Harlan Cruz," she said. "I see you." A pause. Then the sound of a horse shifting. Then Harlan's voice coming out of the dark with an edge that wasn't quite as steady as he wanted it to be. "You're brave for a China girl standing alone in the dark." "I'm not brave," Rose said. "I'm just out of patience." A beat. "You should go back to your horses." "You should go home," Rose said. "Tonight, for good. And not come back to this fence line." She kept her voice even. "Because here is what's going to happen if you don't. Alderman in Beaumont already has a file with your name in it from the creek incident. Dorothy Hatch has been in this county 30 years, and she knows every judge from here to Austin. And Eli Thorne." She paused. "You already know what Eli Thorne does when someone threatens what's his." The dark was quiet, except for the fire behind her and the men working it. "This ain't over," Harlan said, but his voice had shifted. The performance of threat was still there, but the conviction underneath it had thinned. "It can be," Rose said. "That's your choice to make." She turned her back on him and walked back to the horses. It was the hardest part, turning her back. Every muscle in her body wanted to keep her eyes on that tree line. She walked back at a steady pace and untied the horses and stood with them and listened. After 2 minutes, she heard hoofbeats moving away north through the trees. She let out a breath that felt like it had been held for about 6 weeks. By midnight, the fire was out. Not fully, not down to cool ash it would need watching until morning, but controlled, pushed back, contained. Dorothy's boys were moving along the burned line doing final checks. The smell of smoke was in everything, hair and clothes and the back of the throat. Eli came back to her face streaked and exhausted. He looked at her, then at the tree line. "You talked to him," he said. "It wasn't a question." Yes. He's gone. He rode north. I don't think he'll come back. Eli looked at her for a long moment. With that expression, she had come to know the one that wasn't quite disbelief and wasn't quite pride, but something that lived between the two. You walked into the dark after a man who just set a fire on my land. I did. I told you to stay with the horses. You told me you needed someone you trusted with the horses. The horses were tied and fine. Harlan Cruz was in the tree line watching the fire he set. She met his eyes. I did the math. Dorothy appeared at Eli's shoulder, soot on her face and satisfaction in her eyes in equal measure. She looked at Rose. She looked at the tree line. She put the pieces together in about 4 seconds. You talked him off, Dorothy said. I gave him a way out that didn't require him to be cornered, Rose said. Cornered men are dangerous. Men who think they made a choice are easier to manage. Dorothy looked at her for a long moment. Then she said in a voice that had dropped all its careful social management and was just one woman talking to another. Eli Thorne, where on earth did you find this woman? She was in the square in Dusthaven, Eli said, standing in the sun in a wedding dress. Dorothy made a sound that was both a laugh and something else entirely. She put her hand briefly on Rose's shoulder. Not a pat, not a gesture of comfort, but the deliberate press of an equal, and then went back to her sons. They didn't ride home until nearly 2 in the morning. Rose was so tired she was riding mostly on habit, and Eli had the particular silence of a man who was going to be sore for 3 days and knew it, and had decided not to mention it. The stars were enormous and indifferent and beautiful over the Texas dark. Rose, Eli said. I need to tell you something. She came a little more awake. His voice had the weight in it. When I rode into that square 6 weeks ago, he said, I told myself it was because it was the right thing to do, the legal thing, the decent thing. He paused. That was true, but it wasn't the whole truth. She waited. Clara. He stopped. I told you about Clara. What I didn't tell you is that I'd been blaming myself for 3 years, not for her dying. The fever wasn't mine to stop. But for the year before she died, when I was so caught up in the land dispute and the money problems in my own... He exhaled. I wasn't present. I was there in the body, and somewhere else entirely, in the ways that mattered. And by the time I understood what I'd been doing, she was gone, and there was nothing left to do about it. Rose said nothing. She listened. When I saw you in that square, Eli said, pressing your hand against your palm, looking at the horizon like you were calculating whether you could run, I thought this is a person who is completely alone in a crowd of people who should be helping her. And I thought, his voice was rough, I thought not this time, not if I can help it. Rose held that for a moment, felt the shape of it. So it wasn't just about the law, she said. No. It was about Clara. At first, he said. At first, it was about Clara and about the man I didn't manage to be in time to matter. But somewhere between you reorganizing my kitchen and you learning the word boundary and you standing in that creek telling Harlan Cruz exactly where he could stand. He paused. It stopped being about Clara. What did it become about? Silence. The horses walked on. You, he said. Just you. Rose looked at the stars. She thought about the word guy, about returning to the place you were always meant to be, about how strange it was that the place she was always meant to be turned out to be a cedar-smelling room with a lockable door on a ranch she'd never heard of 6 weeks ago. I have something to ask you, she said. All right. The English lesson, 3 weeks ago. The word you chose. She paused. Home. Why that word first? Eli was quiet for a moment. Because it was the word I thought you needed most, he said. And the one I thought I'd forgotten how to mean. Rose looked down at her hands in the dark. H-O-M-E, she said softly. I remember. I know you do, Eli said. You wrote it 4 times. The 4th time I understood it, she said. Not the definition. The meaning. He didn't ask what the difference was. He already knew. She reached forward and put her hand on his back between his shoulder blades and felt him breathe. They rode home. Chen Bingwen died on a Thursday, 6 days after Rose had sat beside his bed and given him the only thing she had to give her presence, chosen freely no more and no less. Wei sent word by rider. He didn't come himself, which Rose understood was his way of giving her space to feel whatever she was going to feel without the complication of his face in the room. She sat on the porch when the rider left and held the red cloth pouch and said nothing for a long time. Eli came and sat beside her. He didn't speak. He didn't try to fix the silence or fill it with consolation. He just sat with her in the particular way that had become in 6 weeks. The thing she counted on most, his presence as a fact, steady and undemanding. The way the creek was a fact, or the morning was a fact. Something you could rely on without having to negotiate. He said he was sorry, Rose said finally. I know. He didn't say it the right way. He didn't say the right words. He said, I made a mistake, and your mother would have. She paused. But I think he meant it. I think somewhere in him he knew exactly what he had done, and he had been not thinking about it for a very long time, and the dying made him stop not thinking about it. That happens, Eli said. It's not enough, Rose said. But it's something. She turned the pouch over in her hands. It's more than I had yesterday. She went back to Dusthaven the next day to handle arrangements alongside Wei. They moved around each other carefully like people navigating a room with breakable things on every surface, neither of them willing to cause any more damage than had already been done. They were not reconciled. They were not family in any warm sense of the word, but they were something two people who shared an origin and a history and had managed minimally and imperfectly to look each other in the face without lying. Wei stopped her at the door when she was leaving. The Galveston thing, he said. Stokes, that was my idea too. Rose looked at him. After we left Dusthaven, I ran into Stokes on the road. I told him where you were. I told him you were living at Thorne's ranch with no formal arrangement. He met her eyes with the bleak directness he'd found on the road 2 days ago. He came up with the legal angle himself, but I gave him the information. The air went out of the room. Rose stood absolutely still. Why are you telling me this now? She said, and her voice was quiet in the specific way that is more serious than shouting. Because I told you I would tell you the true shape of things, Wei said, even when the shape is ugly. He swallowed. I'm telling you because you deserve to know, and because I'm done deciding what's good for you without asking you. Rose looked at her brother for a long time. She thought about Alderman, about the emergency motion and Judge Reynolds and the word dismissed, about the Beaumont Gazette piece and Stokes deciding an appeal was strategically inadvisable. She thought about how close it had come, how a slightly slower lawyer, a slightly less careful judge, a slightly less public story might have gone the other way entirely. You almost destroyed my life, she said. Twice. I know. The first time you told yourself it was practical. What did you tell yourself the second time? Wei looked at the floor. That you'd be fine, he said. That Thorne would fight it and win, and nothing would really happen to you. And if it hadn't worked out that way... He didn't answer. He didn't have an answer because there wasn't one, and they both knew it. Rose picked up her bag. She walked to the door. Then she stopped with her hand on the frame and didn't turn around. Wei, she said. He was quiet. I'm not going to carry this for you, she said. What you did, what it cost me, what it could have cost me, that's yours to carry, not mine. She paused. But I'll tell you this once. If you want to spend the rest of your life being the man who did those things, that's your choice. If you want to spend it being someone else, someone worth the trouble of knowing, that's also your choice. She let go of the doorframe. I have enough to do building my own life. I can't build yours for you, but I'll notice if you do it yourself. She walked out. She rode back to Eli's ranch, and she did not cry on the road because she had made a decision about crying on roads that she was not going to do it when she was alone, when there was no one to hold the other end of it. She was going to save the hard things for rooms with locked doors and people she trusted. She cried in the kitchen 30 seconds after she walked through the door and found Eli at the table with coffee and the day's letters, and that completely ordinary Tuesday morning face that meant nothing unusual was required of either of them today. The sight of it undid her. She didn't know why that was the thing that did it. Not the tragedy, but the ordinary. The sheer unremarkable normalcy of a man having coffee at a table in a home that was becoming incrementally and irrevocably hers too. Eli was up and across the kitchen in about 4 seconds flat. He didn't say anything. He put his arms around her, and she pressed her face into the front of his shirt and held on, and he held back solid and steady, and not trying to make it stop or speed it up or convert it into something more manageable, just letting it be what it was. She cried for about 3 minutes. Then she pulled back, wiped her face with the back of her hand and said, "Way told me he was the one who went to Stokes." Eli's arms didn't loosen. "I know," he said. She pulled back further, looked at him. "You knew." Alderman figured it out when he was tracing how Stokes got the information so fast. Told me when we were in Beaumont. His jaw was tight. "I didn't tell you because I thought you had enough to carry that day." "You should have told me." "Yes," he said. "I should have. That was wrong." She looked at him. "Don't do that again. Don't decide what I can carry." "You're right," he said. "No defense, no explanation, just you're right. I won't." She stepped back fully. She picked up the coffee pot and poured herself a cup and sat down at the table and said, "Tell me about the letters," because sometimes the way back to solid ground was through the mundane, and she had learned that from watching him do exactly that on the hard days. He sat down. He picked up the first letter. He told her about the letters. 3 weeks later, on a Sunday, Eli came in from the south fence line in the early evening and found Rose on the porch. She was sitting in the good chair, the one he'd built over the winter before she arrived, which had the wide armrests and the particular angle of lean that meant you could sit in it for hours, and she was looking at the horizon with an expression he'd learned to read. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. "A question," she said. "Ask it." She looked at him. In the 6 weeks since the fire, something had shifted between them, not suddenly, not with any ceremony, but the way rivers shift course inch by inch, until one day you look up and realize the water is somewhere completely different from where it used to be. They had stopped being two people sharing a space and had become, without a formal agreement, something that functioned unmistakably as a unit. "When you sat in Alderman's office," she said, "and I gave my deposition, when he asked you to step out so he could ask me certain questions alone. I remember. He asked me if I felt safe, if I was here freely, if there was any duress." She paused. "I said yes, yes, and no." Eli sat down in the step. He looked at her. "That's the truth," he said. "Yes," she said. "It is." She turned the cup in her hands. "But here is the question I've been sitting with. You rode into that square to do the right thing. That's how it started. And somewhere along the way, it became something else. For both of us." She met his eyes. "And I want to know the rest of our lives. What do we call it?" Eli looked at her for a long time. He stood up. He went inside. She heard the drawer in his desk open and close. He came back out and sat down on the step in front of her at her level, and he was holding something. He opened his hand. It was a length of red thread, not the same thread that was in her mother's pouch, that one was old and precious, and not for this purpose, but red thread bought from Mrs. Liu's shop in Beaumont on the same trip where he had also bought the first length, the one he'd given her on the night she'd first understood the word gooey, even though she hadn't said it out loud yet. "I asked Dorothy about it," he said. "About what the thread means, all of it, not just the tying." He paused. She said, and I think Dorothy talked to Mrs. Liu for about 2 hours. Getting this right, she said that in your tradition, the red thread means the beginning of a woman's life, with someone is witnessed. That the thread says this is real, this is chosen, this is not by accident. Rose looked at the thread in his hand. I know I'm not a preacher, Eli said. I know I'm not doing this the way anyone would recognize as proper. I know that what I'm offering is a ranch with a partly collapsed south fence, and a financial situation that is improving but not finished improving, and a past I'm still working through. He paused. But I also know that this, he gestured between them with the thread. Whatever this is, and whatever we call it, is the most certain thing I have felt since the wrongest time of my life, and I don't want to call it nothing anymore. Rose looked at the thread. She thought about her mother stitching red peonies into a wedding dress by lamplight, knowing maybe that things were not going to be simple for her daughter. She thought about the 12-year-old girl who had carried a red cloth pouch through 14 years of being told she was worth nothing and had refused quietly, stubbornly, without anyone to witness it, to entirely believe them. She thought about a Tuesday morning in a hot Texas square, pressing her nails into her palm. She thought about a man who had noticed. She reached out and took the thread from his hand. She tied one end around her own wrist, the old way, the way her mother had described it, 3 loops and a careful knot, and then she held the other end out to Eli. He held out his wrist. She tied it, slowly, carefully. In my language, she said, there is a word, gui. She looked at him. It means, returning to the place you were always meant to be. It is what people say when something ends well, when something lands where it was supposed to land. Eli looked at the thread on his wrist. He looked at her. Gui, he said imperfectly, trying out the sound. Close enough, Rose said. He laughed. A full, real laugh, the first one she had heard from him, that had no reservation in it, nothing held back for safekeeping. It was the laugh of a man who had decided fully, and without a remaining exit strategy, to be where he was. She laughed with him. The evening settled around them. The cicadas rose. The sugarberry grove beyond the creek moved in the small, warm wind. Somewhere in the barn, a horse shifted in its stall, and from the direction of the hatch spread came the far-off sound of Dorothy's boys finishing their evening chores and calling across the yard to each other the ordinary music of people building their lives in the same general direction. Rose Chen sat on the porch of her home with red thread on her wrist and her hand in the hand of a man who had learned the word gui on a Sunday evening in Texas, and she thought my father sold me as a joke. He handed me to the summer dust of Dust Haven and walked away and believed that was the end of the story. He was wrong. This was not the end of her story. This was the place where it finally, fully, without any remaining doubt, began.